Lila was not like the other girls in her village. From the moment she could hold a knife safely in her small hands, she had an uncanny talent for carving wood. Birds, animals, and intricate patterns seemed to spring to life beneath her touch, as if the wood itself obeyed her will. By the age of 16, her skill had become known not just in her household but across the village, drawing admiration and, in secret, envy. The villagers whispered that she had been touched by a spirit of creativity, though Lila herself laughed off such notions, preferring to focus on her work and her family. She lived in a cluster of huts on the outskirts of the village, where the river wound lazily past fields of millet and maize. Her mother, Amina, was a woman of quiet strength, who had raised Lila alone after her father had passed when Lila was only a baby. Amina's eyes shone with pride at her daughter's cleverness and independence. Lila's younger brother, Kofi, adored her and often followed her like a shadow, carrying small tools or helping with chores. Every evening after the work of the day was done, they would sit near the fire, Lila carving a small figurine while Kofi asked questions about her designs, marveling at how lifelike each bird or animal seemed. The village itself was a place of structure and tradition. The elders sat in a semicircle beneath the oldest baobab tree, their wrinkled faces and stooped shoulders commanding respect. Every decision, from disputes between neighbors to the allocation of communal land, passed through their careful consideration. Among the villagers, obedience and deference to these elders were expected. Young people were taught to follow rules, respect hierarchy, and honor customs. Any act of defiance, no matter how small, was met with gossip, subtle warnings, or in more severe cases public reprimand. Despite the rigid order of village life, Lila moved through it with a mixture of grace and curiosity. She greeted everyone with warmth, shared her carved trinkets freely, and often helped neighbors with tasks they could not manage alone. Her laughter was soft but infectious, carrying across the dusted paths and fields, drawing smiles from even the sternest elders. Children flocked to her, not just for the gifts she gave but for the kindness she radiated. She was clever in her wit as well, able to solve small disputes or come up with practical solutions to everyday problems, earning her quiet admiration. Yet, as is often the case with those who shine brightly, shadows lingered where light falls. Some villagers, unable to match her skill or charm, began to watch with thinly veiled resentment. Whispers began to circulate, some saying that she was too proud, others questioning why she received so much attention from the elders. Even among her peers, subtle glances of jealousy were cast when Lila's work was praised more than anyone else's. Though the girl remained unaware of most of these murmurs, the atmosphere of envy was like a faint tremor beneath the soil, waiting for a storm. Lila herself, innocent and kind, could sense only the faintest edge of danger, the odd looks or quiet conversations that ceased when she approached. She shrugged them off, believing in the goodness of her neighbors, focusing instead on carving, helping her family, and enjoying the simple joys of village life, the hum of bees near the river, the smell of fresh earth after rain, and the gentle laughter of her friends. But life in the village, with its intricate web of tradition, hierarchy, and human emotion, would not allow such brightness to go unnoticed for long. The seeds of envy and hidden threats, planted in the hearts of those who watched her with bitterness, were beginning to stir, and the peaceful rhythm of her days would soon be shattered. The first cracks in Lila's world began quietly, like shadows stretching across the sunlit village paths. Among those who had once smiled at her carvings or praised her cleverness, some began to frown, whisper, or glance sideways when she passed. The envy had been simmering for months, invisible at first, masked behind polite nods or hollow compliments. But jealousy has a way of taking root in hearts that cannot bear the brilliance of another, and soon, it found voice. It started with murmurs about her beauty. Some older women whose own youth had long faded, muttered that Lila's face was too perfect, her laugh too light. They watched her interactions with the elders, whispering that she was trying to outshine her mother or manipulate the village for personal gain. Among her peers, girls who once admired Lila's skill in carving now looked upon her with thinly veiled resentment, suggesting she had been given favors that others had earned. The tension was subtle, but it gnawed at the edges of everyday life. Relatives of the village elite, eager to maintain their own standing, seized upon these whispers. A cousin, jealous of the attention Lila's mother commanded, hinted to the elders that perhaps the girl was too clever for her own good. "She listens to things she should not," the cousin said with a sly smile, "and she shares stories that might unsettle our children or elders." Such words, laced with insinuation, began to spread, feeding the latent fears of those who valued order over innocence. Then came the false accusation. One afternoon, as Lila worked in the open-air workshop near the river, carefully shaping a small wooden bird. Someone claimed to have seen her take a piece of jewelry from a neighbor's home. The claim was entirely unfounded, but in a village where stories traveled faster than truth, it gained traction. Whispers grew louder, spreading from hut to hut, until even some of Lila's friends avoided her gaze. Children she had once guided and played with crossed the path quickly, as if the air around her had grown dangerous. Lila herself could not understand what was happening. She had never taken anything that was not hers. She tried to speak with the elders, explaining calmly that she had been near the neighbor's house only to deliver a carved figurine as a gift. She pleaded her innocence, her voice steady despite the pit of anxiety in her stomach. But the elders, bound by the weight of caution and the fear of scandal, listened politely yet allowed the seeds of doubt to linger. The atmosphere thickened, heavy with suspicion. The villagers who had once admired her began to find fault in her every action. If she laughed loudly, it was said she was mocking others. If she shared her carvings, she was accused of flaunting skill she did not deserve. Even her mother, despite her unwavering faith in Lila, found herself cast aside in subtle ways. Neighbors avoided her, conversations turned away when she approached. The quiet isolation of the household became palpable, a shadow creeping over the sunlit yard where Lila once played with her brother. Through it all, Lila remained courageous. She spent hours at her workbench, carving tiny symbols of hope into the wood, believing that truth and diligence would eventually shine through. At night, she whispered to the river, speaking of fairness and justice, hoping the water would carry her words to ears that could restore her standing. Yet with every passing day, the weight of suspicion and envy pressed harder, gnawing at her spirit in ways she had never imagined. Her confusion grew into fear when she realized that even attempts to explain herself seemed only to confirm the villagers' worst assumptions. "Why do you defend yourself so eagerly?" they would murmur. "Perhaps there is guilt in the hurry to prove innocence." Lila's world, once filled with laughter and light, now felt encroached upon by shadows. Friends avoided her, neighbors whispered behind doors, and the air of the village, once warm and familiar, became tinged with hostility. Despite the growing danger, she clung to the memory of her mother's voice and her own inner strength. She reminded herself that envy could twist perception but could never touch the truth she held in her heart. Lila could not yet see the path ahead, nor understand the cruelty that would come, but the first warnings were unmistakable. The village that once embraced her now harbored shadows that threatened not only her reputation but her very safety. The subtle manipulations and false accusations were only the beginning of a storm that would change her life forever. The day Lila's life changed forever began with whispers that carried a sharpness in the wind, like dry leaves scraping across stone. By the time she realized the full extent of the villagers' malice, it was too late to hide. They came for her in the early hours of dawn, when the sky was still painted in pale blues and the river murmured gently past the fields. Masked in the guise of authority and justice, the men and women who had once nodded politely to her now surrounded her hut, their eyes hardened, their whispers turned to harsh commands. Lila's mother, Amina, had sensed the growing danger for weeks but never imagined it would culminate in something so monstrous. She stood frozen as the villagers pulled her daughter from the hut, hands trembling, heart pounding. Lila's younger brother, Kofi, screamed and tried to run after her, but a strong arm held him back. The villagers moved swiftly, their collective will enforcing punishment, their faces devoid of the warmth that had once characterized the community. Lila's mind raced, trying to understand what had become of the people she had trusted, but reason offered no solace against the tide of cruelty that had descended. They bound her hands and dragged her to the village square, a place of judgment and gathering, where public punishments were meant to instill fear. The sun rose higher, casting a harsh light on her small figure, and Lila felt the gaze of every villager upon her. Some averted their eyes, unable to watch, while others leaned closer, curiosity and malice dancing in their expressions. The elders sat in judgment, faces stern, their previous admiration for her artistry and cleverness now replaced with cold detachment. They declared that envy and suspicion had given way to righteous action, that she had overstepped the boundaries of humility and propriety, and that punishment must be served to maintain order. The moment came with terrifying swiftness. Lila felt sharp pain as the ritual of punishment was carried out. Her hands, once instruments of creation, were severed with brutal efficiency. A scream tore from her throat, raw and unrestrained, a mixture of agony, disbelief, and the primal instinct to survive. Blood mingled with dust beneath her, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt, colors blurring and sounds warping into echoes of horror. Yet amid the terror, Lila's spirit did not falter entirely. Though her body was violated, Her mind clung fiercely to life and to the memory of all she had loved. Pain and despair coursed through her, but she refused to surrender completely. Even as her vision swam with tears and her limbs trembled, she focused on her inner strength, drawing on the lessons of her mother's courage and the quiet resilience she had cultivated over the years. Lila's thoughts were sharp. She would not allow fear to claim her entirely, nor would she let the cruelty of others define her worth. The villagers had taken her hands, but they could not yet touch the core of her spirit. Her mother wept openly, grief-stricken, clutching at the air as if she could somehow restore her daughter's severed hands with the force of love alone. Kofi's cries echoed through the village, a mixture of fear, sorrow, and rage. Some villagers felt a pang of guilt, their faces momentarily clouded, but the momentum of collective cruelty pushed them forward. Whispers of justice and obedience filled the square, as though repeating them could mask the enormity of what had been done. As Lila was left in the square, the magnitude of the punishment became painfully clear. The tools she had once used to carve life from would lay scattered nearby, silent witnesses to the destruction of her agency. Her family knelt by her side, their mourning mingling with helplessness, but the girl's resolve remained. Despite the terror and pain, despite the blood and the cries, she refused to yield her inner light. She whispered softly to herself, a mantra of defiance, that her spirit, though battered, could not be broken, that her mind and heart were still her own. The wider village watched in uneasy silence. Some could no longer look at her, their conscience pricking their hearts. Others stood rigid, unsure if they had acted rightly or simply followed the momentum of fear and envy. The elders, despite their authority, exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the wrongness of their decree, yet bound by the rigid expectations of the social order. Even in the face of such brutality, a quiet energy began to pulse from Lila, a subtle, almost imperceptible defiance that suggested the story was far from over. Though the hands that had carved birds, flowers, and stories from wood were gone, Lila's mind remained sharp. Her courage was a quiet flame, flickering but unextinguished, promising that those who had inflicted terror had awakened a force far greater than they could comprehend. Her spirit, though tested to the limits of human endurance, refused to bow, hinting that the reckoning to come would be as extraordinary as the cruelty that had sparked it. Lila lay on the hard sun-scorched earth, blood drying around her wrists where her hands had once been. The pain was immense, a searing fire that raced through her body and clouded her mind, yet deeper than the agony of flesh was the ache of betrayal, the sting of cruelty, the injustice that had been carved into her very life. She closed her eyes and let the tears fall, but in that darkness, something extraordinary stirred. Something that had always existed alongside her, silent and unobserved, began to awaken. Her shadow, once a simple silhouette on sunlit walls and dusty ground, shifted subtly, stretching and writhing with a strange consciousness of its own. At first, it was imperceptible, a flicker at the edge of her vision. Lila blinked, unsure if her mind, fatigued and in torment, was playing tricks. But then the shadow moved deliberately, stretching past the bounds of her body, its edges quivering with an almost sentient intent. It was as though it had absorbed the searing anguish of her pain, the boiling anger at the villagers who had harmed her, and the desperate longing for justice she had kept locked within. Slowly, the shadow began to act independently, sliding across the earth, brushing against the fallen tools and carvings she had once loved, and lifting them ever so slightly as if testing its newfound power. Lila felt the connection immediately. The shadow was no longer merely a passive reflection of her form, it was an extension of her very soul, a mirror of her rage, her fear, and her unbroken spirit. Though her hands were gone, she realized, a new power had emerged, one that did not require flesh or tools. The shadow could reach where she could not, touch what she could no longer grasp, and act where she had been rendered helpless. Its movements were silent but deliberate, precise yet imbued with a strange, almost liquid grace. As the sun climbed higher, casting the village in a harsh glare, the shadow began experimenting. A small knife that had fallen during her punishment wobbled slightly, lifted by an invisible force. Lila's eyes widened in astonishment and disbelief, her heart pounding with both fear and exhilaration. She reached out with her thoughts, focusing her will, and the shadow obeyed, tilting the knife just slightly, enough for her to understand that it was learning. Learning to manipulate, to respond, to carry out intentions she had not yet spoken aloud. Night fell and the shadow grew bolder. It slithered across the walls of her home when the village slept, brushing past those who had harmed her, unseen and unfelt. Windows rattled, a subtle draft shifted, and objects in empty rooms trembled. Small animals scuttled nervously, sensing the unnatural presence but unable to identify its source. The villagers, who had once feared her only for her skill or her spirit, now felt a creeping unease they could not explain. Whispers of spirits, of curses, began to circulate, though no one suspected the true origin. Lila herself practiced in the dark, extending her will through the shadow. She found she could guide it with intention, infuse it with specific desires: a knife to fall, a whisper of cold wind to chill a heart, a fleeting impression of fear in those who had wronged her. And yet, even as the shadow obeyed, Lila sensed its independent intelligence, its awareness of her anger and grief. It was not merely a tool, it was a partner, a guardian, a silent avenger born from cruelty and pain. The shadow became a reflection of all that Lila had lost, but also of all she still possessed. It carried the fire of her resolve, the memory of her skill, the courage she had shown even in the square, and the quiet defiance she refused to abandon. Each night it moved further, experimenting with its reach, testing its ability to influence the world around it without revealing its presence. The villagers began to feel the stirrings of something they could not name: doors creaking when no wind blew, knives tilting at impossible angles, shadows flickering where no light should exist. Fear, the most human of emotions, began to seep into their hearts. In her mind, Lila whispered to the shadow, and in return, it seemed to respond with intent. She realized that vengeance need not be brutal, it could be precise, clever, and undeniable. Her hands might have been taken, but her power had multiplied, carried not in flesh but in shadow. And somewhere, in the corners of the village that had caused her so much pain, a quiet tremor of anxiety began to ripple, the first sign that the reckoning would not wait forever, that the girl who had been violated could now influence the world in ways no one had imagined. The first signs were subtle, almost easy to dismiss. A villager would reach for a knife in the kitchen, only to find it missing as if it had walked away on its own. A bundle of farming tools would vanish overnight, only to appear leaning neatly against a tree in the morning, in places no one had touched. Doors would creak open when no wind blew, and faint whispers drifted through empty huts, soft enough to make one pause mid-step, wondering if the breeze carried voices from another world. Some villagers, superstitious by nature, began to whisper among themselves, eyes darting nervously whenever Lila passed, even though she remained confined to her home. For Lila, these events were both exhilarating and terrifying. The shadow that had awakened alongside her pain was growing more capable, more confident in its actions. Yet controlling it required concentration, focus, and a delicate balance between intention and morality. She experimented cautiously, sending it to lift a fallen jug, to nudge a misplaced tool, or to create minor disturbances in empty rooms. Each success gave her a sense of empowerment she had never felt before, yet it also left her heart heavy. She did not want to harm innocents, nor did she wish to become the very embodiment of fear that the villagers had once embodied for her. The moral struggle weighed heavily on her. Every time she considered allowing the shadow to teach a more severe lesson, she hesitated. She remembered her mother's words: "Justice does not need cruelty to be real, Lila. Let your heart guide your hands even when your hands are gone." The shadow, sensitive to her emotions, seemed to respond accordingly, carrying out only what she subconsciously allowed it to. It was as if it could sense her inner turmoil, acting as both her instrument of power and her moral compass, nudging her toward restraint even as it demonstrated what it could achieve without restraint. Villagers' unease began to grow. Tools would disappear in the middle of the day and reappear in impossible locations, sometimes atop rooftops, sometimes hanging from tree branches. Knives fell from shelves without explanation. Windows rattled in empty rooms and faint, almost melodic whispers drifted through corridors. Even those who had ignored the whispers of jealousy or gossip before now glanced nervously at one another, eyes wide with suspicion, and murmured that spirits haunted the village. Mothers clutched their children closer, elders muttered protective prayers, and the once bustling marketplace felt heavier, as if the air itself carried tension. Despite the subtle fear she inspired, Lila's greatest challenge remained the shadow itself. It was powerful, yes, but unpredictable, reacting not only to her conscious will but to her deepest emotions: fear, anger, and desire for justice. If she allowed rage to surge, the shadow could act with frightening precision. If she remained calm, it would limit its actions to small disturbances. Lila spent long nights meditating under the starlit sky, whispering to her shadow, training it with patience, teaching it to respect life even as it prepared to protect her and assert her power. Even as she honed her control, the signs of vengeance were undeniable. Villagers spoke in hushed tones about curses and spirits, claiming that the village itself seemed restless. A child reported seeing a dark figure flit across the courtyard at night, silent but unnervingly deliberate. A farmer discovered that his freshly harvested millet had been piled neatly into a pattern that resembled human hands. Fear mingled with curiosity, and the village grew divided. Some believed the girl's spirit had returned, others that she had been granted protection by ancestral forces. Lila meanwhile felt both pride and sorrow. She understood that her shadow was a manifestation of her anger, grief, and desire for justice, but she also knew the danger of letting that force operate unchecked. Every flicker of movement, every tool nudged or fallen knife, reminded her of her power, but also of the responsibility it carried. She vowed that vengeance would not corrupt her completely. She would strike only when necessary, and always in a way that reflected justice rather than cruelty. In the quiet hours of the night, as the village slept uneasily, Lila whispered to the darkness, affirming that the shadow's awakening was not merely for fear, but for the restoration of balance, a warning that those who had wronged her could no longer act with impunity. Though Lila could no longer wield her hands, her mind remained sharp, her spirit unbroken. She realized that to survive and enact justice, she would need allies beyond herself. The shadow, powerful yet bound by her will, could act, but it could not think beyond the limits of her imagination or compensate for the nuances of strategy she possessed. So she began to look for help in the corners of her world, in places others overlooked, where unseen forces might recognize the injustice inflicted upon her. Her first allies were the creatures of the forest that bordered the village. Birds with sharp eyes, who had often perched near her carving station, now seemed to understand her pain. They circled high above the huts, observing the movements of those who had wronged her, alerting her with a sudden shift in flight or a sharp, deliberate cry when danger or opportunity arose. Small mammals, once playful and timid, now lingered near her doorway, acting as silent sentinels. Even snakes, creatures the villagers feared, appeared to her side, sensing the shadow's energy and aligning instinctively with her presence. But it was not only animals who came to her aid. Spirits, lingering remnants of ancestors and guardians of the land, began to respond to the imbalance she had suffered. At night, faint whispers danced on the breeze, speaking words of encouragement, advice, and warnings. Lila would trace her fingers over the ground, imagining the paths she could no longer navigate with her hands, and the spirits would guide the shadow accordingly. A leaf might fall in a specific pattern, signaling a safe path, or a flicker of candlelight might reveal a hidden object, offering her the tools to influence events indirectly. Among humans, a few sympathetic villagers recognized the injustice that had befallen her. They had watched the punishment with unease, noting the cruelty but fearing reprisal. One elderly woman, wise and observant, discreetly left small items for Lila: herbs for healing, scraps of paper with advice, and occasionally messages of encouragement. A young boy, whose parents had shown kindness to her family before, became a courier for these secret exchanges. Through them, Lila realized that courage and empathy still existed in the village, hidden under layers of fear and conformity. The shadow, responsive and ever-learning, began to interact with these allies. It guided birds to signal Lila when someone approached, nudged objects to attract attention in precise ways, and occasionally whispered to the spirits in ways only they could perceive. Lila, in turn, learned to coordinate their actions, training the shadow to be not just a tool of vengeance but a conduit for strategy. Each night, she would lie in the quiet of her small home, speaking to her allies, and the air would seem alive with movement. The flutter of wings, the rustle of leaves, the faint glimmer of spiritual energy weaving in unseen patterns. Her cleverness and resilience became apparent through these interactions. She devised plans that did not require her physical presence but relied on observation, intuition, and the coordinated efforts of her shadow and allies. She could cause a villager to find a knife mysteriously positioned where it would startle and frighten, or have a messenger bird drop a message that revealed hidden plots, all without ever touching a single object herself. Every success reinforced her confidence and revealed the growing intelligence of the shadow, which seemed to anticipate actions and adapt in ways even she had not intended. Even in moments of doubt, when fear whispered that her situation was hopeless, the bond between Lila, her shadow, and her allies reminded her that power does not always require strength of flesh. Her influence over events was growing, subtle yet undeniable, a force that combined cunning, mystical assistance, and the raw determination of a spirit that refused to bow. The village, which had once humiliated and terrorized her, now existed under the quiet pressure of an unseen intelligence, guided by a young girl who had been stripped of her hands but not her will. Through the night, Lila reflected on the depth of her resilience. Every alliance formed, every whisper of wind, every flicker of spirit energy, strengthened her understanding that she was no longer alone. Her shadow was not just a reflection of her grief, it was the beginning of a network of influence, a silent army of natural and mystical forces that recognized the injustice done to her. The reckoning to come would be clever, deliberate, and unyielding, a testament to her cunning, her patience, and the extraordinary bond she had nurtured between herself, her shadow, and the allies who answered her call. The shadow, now a living extension of Lila's spirit, faced its first true trials. The villagers had begun to notice strange occurrences, small disturbances that could no longer be dismissed as coincidences. If the shadow acted too boldly, it risked exposing Lila's presence and purpose. Each night, she whispered instructions into the darkness, and the shadow responded, testing the limits of its abilities and learning the delicate balance between power and subtlety. Its first challenge was simple yet essential: move unnoticed. A misplaced knife, a falling jug, or a softly shifted mat could alert the wrong eyes and bring punishment instead of justice. Lila trained it to act like the wind, like the shadows of leaves, brushing against surfaces and moving objects in ways that seemed natural yet unnerving. Soon the trials became more complex. The shadow was tasked with retrieving small tokens of importance from hidden corners of the village, tools, letters, or objects that could reveal conspiracies. The first attempt was clumsy. A falling bucket startled a neighbor who nearly cried out. Lila guided it gently, teaching the shadow to consider weight, balance, and timing. It learned to lift, nudge, and manipulate with precision, guided by her intent yet autonomous in execution. Each success reinforced their bond, and Lila felt a flicker of hope, the possibility that she could reclaim her dignity without compromising her moral compass. The mystical elements of her world began to test the shadow further. A family of talking monkeys appeared one evening, perched on the rooftops and speaking in riddles that only Lila could understand. "Balance anger with patience, and the wind will carry your justice," they said. The shadow, attuned to her emotions, absorbed the lesson, learning to temper its actions with cunning rather than raw force. In another instance, an enchanted mirror in the village elder's home reflected not reality, but intentions. The shadow passed beneath its surface, discovering illusions meant to confuse and trap it. Lila guided it patiently, reminding it that cleverness could surpass brute strength, and that perception often mattered more than physical action. Ancestral guidance also began to manifest. Wisps of spirit light hovered in the corners of her home at night, whispering advice and encouragement. "Your courage is your weapon, your restraint is your shield," they murmured. Lila meditated, sending her shadow to interact with these spectral messengers. Each interaction honed its intelligence, teaching it to navigate danger, anticipate movement, and even leave subtle warnings for those sympathetic to her cause. Through these trials, she realized that vengeance alone was not enough. Strategy, wisdom, and moral clarity were equally vital. The shadow faced external threats as well. Some villagers, growing suspicious, began patrolling areas near her home, seeking to uncover the source of disturbances. The shadow moved invisibly, creating distractions, nudging objects into strategic positions, and whispering faint, frightening echoes to unnerve intruders. Its movements were precise and deliberate, guided by Lila's intent and enhanced by its own developing intuition. Each success bolstered Lila's confidence. She saw that her spirit, though dismembered physically, had grown stronger in ways she could never have imagined. Yet the greatest trial was internal. The shadow, infused with her anger and desire for justice, occasionally acted on impulses that Lila had not consciously willed. A vase toppled too forcefully, startling a child. A knife fell too close to a villager. Each misstep reminded her that power without control could become destructive. She spent hours reflecting, calming herself, whispering to the shadow, and teaching it to channel its energy wisely. Over time, it learned to anticipate her intent before she spoke, to adjust the force and timing of its actions, and to act with discretion even in moments of temptation. Through these trials, Lila understood the depth of her resilience. The shadow had become more than a weapon. It was a teacher, a guide, and a reflection of her own ingenuity and moral resolve. The villagers' fear grew, yet they could not comprehend the source. A force unseen, governed by a girl who had been broken but refused to bow. Each success of the shadow not only brought her closer to justice but also nurtured hope within her heart. Hope that the balance of her world could be restored, that cruelty could be confronted with intelligence and cunning, and that the reckoning she had imagined would one day arrive. The village had become restless, its once familiar rhythms disrupted by a series of inexplicable events. Pots clattered to the ground, tools vanished only to reappear in impossible places, and shadows flickered unnaturally under the moonlight. The whispers grew louder, spreading fear among those who had tormented Lila. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, elders muttered prayers, and even the most skeptical villagers began to glance nervously over their shoulders. The air itself seemed charged, heavy with anticipation, as if the world itself had recognized that justice was about to be served. Inside her small home, Lila focused her mind, channeling every ounce of anger, sorrow, and resolve into the shadow. It shimmered and pulsed with energy, a living extension of her will, ready to execute the plan she had crafted with meticulous care. She did not seek mindless vengeance. She sought a reckoning that would reveal the truth of cruelty, fear, and envy to all who had harmed her. Each movement, each subtle action of the shadow, was calculated to inspire awe and terror without causing unnecessary harm. The first of the key antagonists felt it almost immediately. A man who had mocked Lila's carving skills found the tools in his workshop displaced, balanced precariously in impossible angles. Knives dangled over the edge of counters, tilting and swaying as though guided by invisible hands. When he reached a steady one, it fell sharply near his foot, startling him into stumbling backward. He looked around frantically, eyes wide with disbelief, his voice cracking as he muttered that the spirits were restless. The shadow had acted with precision, creating fear without leaving evidence, a silent proclamation that those who had inflicted pain would now feel the weight of their actions. Another antagonist, a woman who had spread false rumors, awoke one night to find her reflection in the water distorted. It moved independently, her image smirking and shaking its head as if judging her. She screamed, and the sound echoed through the village, carrying the essence of her own wrongdoing back to her in a haunting, inescapable form. The shadow had learned to manipulate perception, twisting reality subtly enough to terrify, yet never breaking the boundaries of natural law. It was a symbol, a warning, and a revelation all at once. The more the villagers noticed these events, the more their fear intensified. Doors creaked open when no one approached, windows rattled though no wind blew, and faint whispers carried through empty corridors, echoing accusations and secrets they had hoped would remain buried. Lila's shadow moved fluidly among them, striking selectively, leaving symbols and impressions of the wrongs they had committed. A carving left in the town square depicted a handless figure standing defiantly, a mirror of Lila's suffering and resilience. It was both an artistic statement and a supernatural warning. From the safety of her home, Lila observed the reactions carefully. She noted who faltered under fear, who confessed their misdeeds to relatives in whispered tones, and who attempted to maintain a facade of bravery. The shadow acted as both agent and messenger, conveying her will while revealing the true character of the villagers. It became clear that fear, when met with intelligence and restraint, could dismantle arrogance and cruelty far more effectively than brute force ever could. As the night deepened, the confrontation reached its peak. Key antagonists found themselves isolated, surrounded by subtle disturbances, a sudden chill, a flickering light, or a faint echo of laughter that seemed both familiar and impossible. Panic and guilt intertwined, their minds racing to understand the source of the terror. The shadow moved between them like a living wraith, intangible yet undeniable, carrying with it the presence of the girl they had wronged. Each manifestation was symbolic, reflecting the specific cruelty they had inflicted upon her. A man who had mocked her skill saw his tools arranged in a pattern of broken hands. A woman who spread lies found her whispers return to her as accusatory murmurs echoing from every corner. By dawn, the village was subdued. Fear had tempered arrogance, guilt had replaced mockery, and whispers of spirits and curses filled every ear. Lila, watching through her awareness of the shadow, felt a cautious satisfaction. The confrontation had been executed with precision, balancing justice and mercy, revealing wrongdoing without causing irreversible harm. Her shadow, now a master of subtle terror and symbolic retribution, had proven itself as a partner, a guardian, and an instrument of the reckoning she had long awaited. As the first light of dawn crept over the village, a hushed stillness settled in the air. The night's events had left the villagers trembling, their hearts heavy with fear and unease. Tools had shifted, whispers had echoed in empty halls, and shadows had moved with a life of their own. Each disturbance, each seemingly impossible occurrence, had been a carefully orchestrated message, a silent testimony to the truth that could no longer be hidden. Slowly, realization began to dawn upon them. The girl they had sought to break was far from defeated. Lila's spirit, once thought fragile and vulnerable, had endured, adapted, and risen stronger than any of them had imagined. The shadow, acting as both messenger and mirror, revealed the lies that had fueled her suffering. The villagers who had spread rumors, whispered envy, or actively conspired against her saw their own actions reflected in the strange events that had unfolded. A woman who had slandered Lila's name witnessed a knife levitating near her, falling just short of harm but precise enough to leave a mark of warning, an emblem of accountability. The man who had ridiculed her carving skills found every tool in his workshop rearranged into intricate patterns, depicting hands severed yet defiant, a stark reminder that cruelty leaves an imprint that cannot be erased. Children and younger villagers who had once giggled at her misfortune, now stared wide-eyed, sensing the power and righteousness that flowed through the invisible presence. Even the elders, steeped in tradition and accustomed to controlling the village's moral compass, recognized the lessons embedded in the events. They whispered among themselves, acknowledging that Lila's punishment had been unjust, that envy and fear had blinded their judgment, and that the cosmic balance of their world had been disturbed by human cruelty. The Shadow's work was not merely retribution, it was revelation, exposing truths that the villagers had ignored or twisted. The most remarkable aspect was how the villagers came to understand the nature of justice. It was not the fear of punishment alone that struck them, nor the supernatural display of the Shadow's power. It was the realization that Lila's resilience, her courage, and her moral integrity had remained unbroken, that she had wielded her pain not as a weapon of indiscriminate wrath but as a beacon of truth. The acts of envy, deceit, and cruelty were laid bare, unmasked by the silent, invisible force that carried her spirit's intent. Some villagers, moved by this revelation, came forward to acknowledge their complicity and express remorse. They spoke of the lessons they had learned, the shame they carried, and the responsibility to restore what they had broken. The Shadow observed, guiding its movements with precision, allowing these moments of confession and reconciliation to unfold without fear of harm. Others, too proud or stubborn, remained silent, yet even they could not deny the undeniable presence of justice, a balance not meted out by human hands, but by the moral weight of the cosmos and the spirit of one who had been wronged. Through it all, Lila's presence remained subtle, almost ethereal, yet undeniably felt. The villagers realized that the girl they had sought to destroy had never truly been powerless. Her shadow had become an instrument of revelation, teaching them that justice could manifest through intelligence, restraint, and moral fortitude. The cosmic or spiritual justice emphasized that cruelty cannot endure indefinitely, that lies and envy will eventually be exposed, and that the natural and supernatural worlds conspire to protect the righteous. By midday the village had transformed. Fear lingered, but it was tempered with understanding. Conversations shifted from gossip to reflection, from judgment to humility. Lila's shadow, having completed its silent but profound work, receded just enough to let the village breathe again, leaving a lingering sense that balance had been restored. The villagers learned a lesson they would carry for generations, that a spirit cannot be destroyed by human cruelty, and that those who attempt to bury truth and goodness will inevitably find their own actions revealed. With the reckoning complete and the villagers fully aware of the truth, life in the village began a slow, careful transformation. Lila, though physically scarred and without her hands, sat surrounded by her family and the few sympathetic villagers who had supported her throughout the ordeal. Her mother brought warm cloths and herbal remedies, gently tending to her injuries while murmuring words of comfort and pride. Friends and allies, both human and mystical, lingered nearby. Birds perched quietly on branches, a snake coiled protectively at her feet, and ethereal lights flickered faintly in the corners of her home. Each presence was a reminder that though her body had been harmed, her spirit remained whole, unbroken, and more formidable than ever. The villagers, once consumed by fear and envy, approached cautiously. Their steps were hesitant, their voices low, as they sought to reconcile with the girl they had wronged. Apologies were offered, some sincere and heartfelt, others hesitant and awkward, but all were met with Lila's quiet acceptance. She did not seek vengeance any longer. She understood that true power lay in restraint, in teaching others the value of justice and respect without further bloodshed. The shadow, now calm and attuned to her presence, hovered protectively, a silent sentinel that mirrored her dignity and inner strength. Its form no longer flickered with anger, but radiated a steady, serene power, a symbol that justice had been served and that protection now flowed outward, not just inward. Though her hands would never return, Lila's ingenuity had not been diminished. She continued to carve and create, guiding tools and materials with the shadow's subtle movements. Villagers watched in awe as objects moved with precision, responding to her unspoken intent. The artistry that had once drawn envy and scorn now drew respect and admiration. Children who had once laughed at her suffering now followed her example, learning that creativity, intelligence, and moral strength could flourish even in adversity. Every intricate design, every carefully arranged object, became a testament to resilience, a living demonstration that true skill is not dependent on physical ability alone. Over time, the village itself began to heal. Fear gave way to understanding and cruelty gave way to honor. The villagers erected a small shrine at the edge of the communal square, not as a monument to punishment, but as a symbol of vigilance, respect, and the protection of the innocent. They whispered to passing children that the shadow which had defended Lila now watched over the village itself, guarding against envy, injustice, and harm. The story of the girl who had been wronged but rose above it became legend, shared around fires and during rituals, teaching generations the importance of courage, morality, and empathy. Lila's shadow became more than a force of retribution. It transformed into a guardian and protector, responding to threats both physical and spiritual. When wandering animals approached the village at night or when intruders sought to exploit its people, the shadow's presence ensured safety. Its movements were subtle yet unmistakable, a flicker in the corner of an eye, a sudden chill or a whisper in the wind, enough to remind all that balance and protection were always present. It had become an extension not only of Lila's power but of her values, embodying vigilance, patience, and a deep, unwavering sense of justice. Surrounded by allies, honored by the community, and guided by her unbreakable spirit, Lila embraced the new rhythm of life. Her body bore scars, her hands were absent, yet her influence and authority had grown beyond imagination. She had demonstrated that true power is rooted in the mind and the heart, that courage and ingenuity can overcome the harshest injustice, and that even in a world governed by fear and envy, the righteous will find a way to restore balance. The shadow, always near, served as a lasting symbol, that though darkness and cruelty may rise, a determined spirit, combined with cleverness and moral clarity, can transform fear into protection, sorrow into strength, and vengeance into enduring justice.